He was a decorated war hero, wounded in combat while leading his men to a celebrated victory. He was the brother of the last emperor, the second man of the realm, living in a palace as the hero of Dosso Alto. And yet, he was permanently banished from the very country he bled for. He became an enemy of the state, first hunted by the Nazis, then by the new republic that replaced them. He was stripped of his home, his name, and his citizenship, dying as a stateless, penniless refugee in an anonymous hotel. His name, Archduke Maximilian Eugen of Austria. How did the dynasty's greatest hero become its most forgotten ghost, erased by everyone, on every side of history? That erasure was inevitable. Maximilian was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled. The 600-year-old empire he was born to serve, and the new republican world that demanded he renounce it just to survive. The empire wasn't a nation, it was a dynasty, millions bound not by identity, but by loyalty to one man. Maximilian entered a realm that was, in all but name, the personal property of his granduncle, Emperor Franz Joseph I. This was the Old Guard, and Franz Joseph was its unmoving, unblinking icon. His reign, which began in the revolutionary fires of 1848, had lasted for nearly 7 decades. He was not just a ruler, he was an institution, a demigod in a field marshal's uniform, the very embodiment of the empire's motto, indivisibiliter asi inseparabiliter. The court he presided over was not the relatively relaxed court of the British, or even the bombastic court of the German Kaiser. It was the Habsburg court, governed by the ancient, suffocatingly formal Spanish's Hof Ceremonial, or Spanish court ceremonial. This was a rigid set of protocols, imported from Spain centuries earlier, that dictated every single aspect of life, from how one ate an egg to who could speak to whom, who could sit, and who must stand. It was a system designed to elevate the monarch to a superhuman level, to create an impenetrable barrier between the dynasty and its subjects. This was a world of whispers, bows, and ironclad precedent. It was a system that prioritized stability above all else, clinging to outdated absolutism and rigid tradition while the world outside the palace walls was screaming for change. This was the world that molded Maximilian, a world that taught him that blood and duty were all that mattered. This world was also defined by Maximilian's immediate and deeply dysfunctional family. His grandfather, Archduke Karl Ludwig, was the brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, a deeply pious man who famously died after drinking infected water from the River Jordan on a pilgrimage. His piety was inherited by Maximilian's mother, Princess Maria Josepha of Saxony, a woman of profound faith and quiet dignity who found herself trapped in a deeply unhappy marriage. Her husband, Maximilian's father, was Archduke Otto Franz, known as the Schöne Erzherzog, or the Handsome Archduke. Otto was the black sheep, the dynasty's charismatic, reckless, and utterly dissolute disaster. He was infamous throughout Europe for his endless stream of mistresses, his drunken escapades, and his staggering lack of judgment. His most notorious scandal, one that encapsulated the rot at the heart of the Old Guard, involved him leaping naked from a private dining room at the Hotel Sacher, wearing nothing but his officer's saber to salute a visiting dignitary. This was the man who was for a time second in line to the throne. He died young in 1906 from syphilis, leaving Maximilian and his brother Karl to be raised by their devout mother, caught between the suffocating piety of the court and the scandalous shadow of their father. This rigid, anachronistic court was sitting atop a volcano, and the volcano was beginning to smoke. The threats to the empire were not just external, they were woven into its very DNA. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was not a nation-state. It was a prison of nations, a vast multi-ethnic patchwork of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Slovaks, Slovens, Croats, Serbs, Ukrainians, Romanians, and Italians, all ruled over by a German-speaking minority. The 1867 Ausgleich, or compromise, had elevated the Hungarians to the status of near-equal partners, creating the dual monarchy. But in doing so, it had furiously alienated the empire's massive Slavic population. The Czechs demanded the same rights as the Hungarians. The Poles dreamed of a restored Poland. And in the south, the Serbs and Croats, agitated by the newly independent aggressive kingdom of Serbia, dreamed of a unified South Slav state. This rising tide of nationalism was the internal threat that was pulling the empire apart at the seams. Externally, the empire was shackled to its powerful, arrogant ally, Germany, a partner that increasingly viewed Austria-Hungary as its junior officer. Their internal data, the sophisticated global data that only a giant like Unilever could collect, was showing something fascinating. While one group of customers was leaving in anger, a new group, younger, more urban, more activist, the so-called Gen Z, was flooding in because of the controversy. This new audience didn't just like the ice cream, they believed in it. Buying Justice remixed wasn't a dessert choice, it was a statement. It was a badge of their own identity. They were not just customers, they were disciples. And crucially for Unilever's balance sheet, this new demographic was intensely loyal and willing to pay a premium for authenticity. This data created a new, cold, and brilliant two-pronged business strategy for Unilever, a strategy to manage the soul it was legally stuck with. Prong 1, isolate the damage. Unilever's leadership recognized that this racial and political debate was primarily an American problem. The brand was becoming toxic in the US, but it was still just a quirky ice cream in its new high-growth markets. So Unilever's global machine went into overdrive. They accelerated their globalization strategy. They poured resources into Asia. But they weren't selling, "We must dismantle white supremacy in Tokyo or Seoul." That would be insane. Instead, their R&D teams, as noted in the outline, developed a range of sophisticated, beautiful, and completely apolitical local flavors. They launched high-end matcha and mochi innovations. This was a brilliant financial hedge. They were using the profits from a safe matcha pint in Japan to offset the losses from a political pint of Justice remixed in America. They were quarantining the soul's damage to a single country. Prong 2, monetize the badge. Back in America, Unilever realized that if this new, younger audience wanted a badge of honor, Unilever would sell them one. This was the birth of the diversification strategy. It wasn't a separate idea. It was a direct consequence of the 2020 political pivot. Unilever's marketing team saw that the brand halo had changed. It was no longer just wholesome or fun. It was now cool. It was rebellious. It had edge. And edge could be sold for a much higher margin than ice cream. They began to collaborate with exclusive high-end fashion designers in New York and London. We are not talking about cheap screen-printed souvenirs. We are talking about partnerships with what are known as hype or streetwear brands, the kind of labels that sell $150 hoodies to kids who are willing to wait in line all night. They launched limited edition sneakers with Nike. They launched capsule collections with fashion brands that the 50-plus audience had never, ever heard of. For the brand's original older fans, this was baffling. Why was their ice cream company suddenly selling $120 shoes? But for Unilever, it was a brilliant financial move. They were leveraging the cultural credibility, which the board's activism had generated, to enter a completely new industry. This new lifestyle business was a perfect financial asset. It was a high-profit, low-risk revenue stream that was completely insulated from the price of milk, the cost of cream, or the public health debate on sugar. It was, as the outline notes, a $50 million a year business. This new model, though cynical, was working. The brand was now a complex global machine. It was making money by selling safe matcha to Japan, expensive hoodies to Gen Z, and radical politics to its American activist base. It seemed, for a brief, chaotic moment, that Unilever had successfully managed the dual engine of conscience and commerce. And then, in 2021, the independent board, emboldened by its central role in the 2020 protests, made a fatal miscalculation. They had taken on Pillsbury and won. They had taken on systemic racism and, in their view, won. They felt untouchable. They believed their moral compass was infallible. So in the summer of 2021, they decided to take on everything. They decided to insert their ice cream brand into the single most complex, divisive, and emotionally charged geopolitical conflict on Earth, the independent board, in a decision that would prove to be the beginning of the end, announced unilaterally that Ben & Jerry's would cease selling its products in the occupied Palestinian territories. This was not a Black Lives Matter protest. This was not Occupy Wall Street. This was a decision that involved international law, sovereign nations, and religious historical claims. This was, for a global corporation, a geopolitical disaster. The time bomb Ben & Jerry had built in 2000, the dragon they had created to protect their child's soul, had just picked a fight it could not win, and its fiery breath was about to burn the entire kingdom to the ground. The war for the soul. The decision was made. In the summer of 2021, the independent board, Empire's battleships, part of a fleet in being that, while powerful, was effectively blockaded in the Adriatic by the French and Italians. This experience didn't just give him technical skills, it exposed him to a different, more meritocratic world than the stifling Vienna court. It was a world of steam, steel, and mathematics, a world his granduncle Franz Joseph could never have understood. He also served as a major in the army, and it was this combination of land and sea experience that made him uniquely qualified to understand the total multi-domain nature of the new war. This pragmatic, hands-on nature made him the ideal partner for his brother, the new emperor. Karl was a man of deep faith, a devoted family man, and a desperate idealist. He had taken the throne in the middle of the war, and unlike the German high command, he saw the catastrophe for what it was, a mutual suicide pact that was bleeding Europe white. From the moment he ascended the throne, Karl's single, overriding obsession was peace. He believed the war was a sin, and that it was his divine duty to end it. But he was trapped. He was shackled to his overbearing German allies who were convinced total victory was just around the corner and surrounded by an Austrian war party that still believed in the conflict. He desperately needed allies, and he turned to the one man he knew he could trust unconditionally, his 21-year-old brother. Maximilian's rise was not a quest for personal power, but a mission of fraternal loyalty. His first great test came just weeks after Karl's coronation. In January 1917, he was dispatched on a mission of supreme importance to travel to the German imperial headquarters at Pless to formally announce his brother's accession to the throne to German Emperor Wilhelm II. This was far more than a diplomatic courtesy. It was a high-stakes confrontation. Picture the scene. The 21-year-old Maximilian, idealistic and earnest, representing a new peace-seeking monarch, walking into the lion's den. The German headquarters was not run by the bombastic posturing Kaiser. It was run by the twin silent dictators of Germany, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, and more terrifyingly, General Erich Ludendorff. These were men of iron and blood, men who saw the war in purely logistical terms, who were at that very moment planning the campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare that would soon drag the United States into the conflict. Into this den of grim, total war militarism came the young Austrian Archduke, tasked with conveying his brother's humanitarian, peace-driven vision. It was a clash of two worlds. We can only imagine the conversations. Maximilian, speaking of his brother's desire for a just peace, his horror at the suffering, being met with the cold, unblinking stares of men who saw such sentiments as weakness. He was treated with the full honors due his rank, of course, but the underlying message from the German High Command was clear. Austria-Hungary was the junior partner, and this talk of peace was at best naive and at worst treacherous. Maximilian returned to Vienna having completed his mission, but with a chilling first-hand understanding of the forces his brother was truly up against. He had been a trusted intermediary, a loyal agent in the dynasty's inner circle, and had proven he could navigate the most treacherous diplomatic waters. His loyalty, in Karl's eyes, was now beyond question, and Karl was about to reward it. In 1917, Emperor Karl made a move of profound symbolic and political significance. He granted his brother Maximilian the use of the magnificent Belvedere Palace as his official residence in Vienna. This was not just a house. This was, perhaps, the most loaded piece of real estate in the entire empire. The Belvedere had been the beloved home of the assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand. More than that, it had been the headquarters of Franz Ferdinand's shadow court, his military chancellery, and the nerve center for his radical reformist plans to save the empire. It was from the Belvedere that Franz Ferdinand had planned to smash the dual monarchy, elevate the Slavic peoples, and create his United States of Greater Austria. It was the palace of the last great reformer, the man whose murder had started the war. By installing his brother in this specific palace, Emperor Karl was sending an unmistakable message to the world. He was declaring that the reformist, federalist vision of Franz Ferdinand, which had been murdered in Sarajevo, was back. Maximilian was not just the emperor's brother. He was now symbolically and practically the heir to that progressive mole-breaking legacy. The Belvedere Palace from 1917 to 1918 became the center of this new vision. Maximilian established his own household, and with Karl's full approval, it became a second, more flexible and dynamic center of power. While Karl was trapped in the ancient, suffocating protocols of the Habsburg Palace or isolated at the military headquarters at Baden, Maximilian was in Vienna at the Belvedere, acting as his eyes, ears, and trusted agent. He hosted diplomats, met with politicians from across the empire's warring factions, and built the very alliances his brother needed to pursue his desperate quest for peace. And here, the tragic dynamic of their relationship, the very nature of Maximilian's foil, becomes clear. The foil was not an enemy, but his own brother, Emperor Karl I. But it was not a foil of opposition, it was a foil of burden versus agency. Karl, as the emperor, was ambitious, politically engaged, and tragically trapped. Every move he made was scrutinized. He was the sovereign, and he bore the crushing solitary weight of 50 million souls. He was the one who had to deal with the insubordinate generals, the starving populations, and the disastrous failed peace attempts. His most famous attempt, the Sixtus Affair of 1917, where he used his brothers-in-law as secret intermediaries to negotiate peace with the French, ended in catastrophic failure. When the French Prime Minister exposed the negotiations, Karl was branded a traitor by his German allies. His credibility was shattered, and he became, in effect, a puppet of Germany. While Karl was being politically crucified, slowly immobilized by the burdens of his office, Maximilian remained dynamic. He was the man of action. As the emperor's shadow, he was not bound by the same paralyzing protocols. He could travel, he could serve in the military, he could meet with people his brother could not. He was the one loyal, mobile, and trusted instrument in Karl's arsenal. While Karl clung to his claim and tried to reform from the top down, eventually being consumed by the effort, Maximilian was the pragmatic agent on the ground, supporting his brother's vision with concrete action. He was the one who could still, in a very real sense, do things. He was the perfect synthesis of the old world and the new, an archduke by blood, but a pragmatic, hands-on naval officer and diplomat by choice. He had assembled his shadow court, he had proven his diplomatic mettle, and he had the full, complete trust of his imperial brother. He had truly broken the mold, and now in the final desperate year of the war, he would prove he was not just a diplomat or a sailor. He would prove he was a warrior. By 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no longer just at war. It was in a state of advanced systemic collapse. The grand multi-ethnic edifice that Maximilian's ancestors had spent 600 years building was now crumbling, not in years, but in months. The crisis was total, and it was a crisis the old guard was utterly incapable of handling. In February 1918, the navy that Maximilian had served in staged a massive mutiny at Cattaro sailors, starving and inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, raised the red flag and demanded peace. The army was in even worse shape. Food shortages were so catastrophic that soldiers at the front were receiving, in some cases, less than 1,000 calories a day. They were, quite literally, starving to death in their own trenches. At home in Vienna and Budapest, populations were rioting for bread. The diverse nationalities of the empire, the Czechs, the Poles, the South Slavs, were no longer just petitioning for autonomy. They were actively in contact with the Allies, planning for the empire's final dismemberment. This was the backdrop for Austria-Hungary's last, desperate gamble, the Battle of the Piave River in June 1918. It was a plan born of pure desperation. The German High Command, having launched their own massive spring offensive in France, demanded that Austria-Hungary launch a similar all-or-nothing attack on the Italian front to draw away Allied troops. The Austrian High Command, a nest of bickering, incompetent, and vain generals, like Svetozar Borojevic and the long-disgraced Konrad von Hötzendorf, cobbled together a disastrous plan. It was an offensive on a 75-mile front, conceived with minimal supplies against a well-informed and well-dug-in Italian army that was now bolstered by French, British, and even American troops. The offensive, launched on June 15, 1918, was one of the single greatest military catastrophes in the empire's history. The soldiers, underfed and diseased, managed to cross the Piave River, but they were immediately pinned down, shelled relentlessly, and when the river flooded, cut off from their own supply lines, they were slaughtered. Within a week, the offensive had completely collapsed. The Austro-Hungarian army lost over 150,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It was not just a defeat, it was a death blow. The army's morale was shattered. It ceased to exist as a truly effective offensive force, and the road to Vienna was now, for the first time, wide open. This was the crisis, a total military, political, and social meltdown that the old generals and their outdated strategies had not only failed to stop, but had actively accelerated. And it is in this exact moment, in the very same week as the Piave disaster, that Archduke Maximilian Eugen, the 23-year-old naval officer turned army major, stepped out of the shadow of his brother and onto the center stage of the war. He was on the Italian front, not far from the Piave, but in a different sector, the Brescia and Garda Prealps. Here, the war was not fought in muddy rivers, but on razor-sharp limestone peaks, a vertical hell of rock, ice, and relentless artillery fire. His objective was a single strategic position, a mountain peak known as Dosso Alto. It was a high fortified mound held by the Italians, a crucial observation post that allowed Italian artillery to direct fire down upon the Austrian valleys. It had to be taken. While the main army was disintegrating at the Piave, Maximilian was tasked with this specific, brutal, and seemingly impossible assault. This was not a job for a theoretical aristocrat. This was a job for the Kaiserjäger, the Emperor's hunters, Austria's elite mountain troops. And Maximilian was with them, not as a distant commander, but as a frontline leader. The assault, launched in the brutal summer heat of June 1918, was a prime example of his hands-on pragmatic nature. This was the antithesis of the Piave. It was not a broad, ill-conceived human wave attack. It was a sharp, focused, and violent storm troop operation, scaling the heights under withering Italian machine gun fire. This was the moment that proved he was not his father, nor just a quiet diplomat. He led his men in the assault, climbing and fighting alongside them, and it was here that his proximity to power became a proximity to death. During the fierce close-quarters combat for the peak, an Italian artillery shell exploded near him. The concussion was violent, ripping through the air, throwing him to the ground. He was wounded. The blast, a deafening, searing, white-hot noise, partially destroyed his hearing. He would be partially deaf for the rest of his life, but he was not stopped. He and his men, in a final ferocious push, overran the Italian positions they captured Dosso Alto. Against all odds, in the middle of the Empire's single worst week of the war, this small, elite force led by the Emperor's 23-year-old brother had achieved a clear, undeniable, and heroic victory. The news was electric. At a time when the official bulletins from the Piave were a litany of disaster and thinly veiled excuses, the capture of Dosso Alto was a ray of pure, unadulterated triumph. It was a propaganda victory of the highest order, but it was also a genuine feat of arms. Maximilian was not just a prince who had shown up. He was a prince who had led, who had bled, and who had won the empire, and his brother reacted immediately. For his leadership and his personal bravery in the face of the enemy, Archduke Maximilian Eugen was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of Leopold with war decoration and swords. This cannot be overstated. This was not a ceremonial honor. This was one of the highest military decorations the empire could bestow, the equivalent of a general's level award for a major, given explicitly for valor and successful command. He was a hero. He returned to Vienna, to his residence at the Belvedere Palace, not just as the emperor's brother, but as the hero of Dosso Alto. He had proven his system right. He had shown that his brand of Habsburg leadership, pragmatic, modern, hands-on, and brave, was the answer. He had succeeded where the old guard had catastrophically failed. He was now at the absolute zenith of his life. He was 23 years old. He was a decorated war hero. He was the trusted head of the shadow court at the Belvedere. He was a proven diplomat. He was handsome, popular, and, most importantly, he was the rock upon which his beleaguered brother, Emperor Karl, could lean. His position in the state was now unassailable. In the line of succession, he was second only to his 6-year-old nephew, Crown Prince Otto. In the suffocating, paranoid atmosphere of the dying empire, where Karl saw potential traitors everywhere, Maximilian was the one man who was completely, unquestionably loyal. It was clear to everyone that should the frail, stressed-out Emperor Karl die, the empire would not be run by a committee of squabbling generals. It would be run by a regent, and that regent would be the single most capable and trusted man in the dynasty, the hero of Dosso Alto, Archduke Maximilian Eugen. The world seemed to be in his grasp. He was the prince of what was and the clear king of what was to be. But there was a grim, tragic irony to his peak. The victory at Dosso Alto, for which he had sacrificed his hearing and cemented his heroic status, was strategically meaningless. The war was already lost. The Italians, in fact, would recapture the peak just 2 months later, in August. He had, in essence, reached the highest point of his life on the summit of a volcano, just as it exploded. This was the absolute peak, the summit, the highest, brightest, and most glorious moment of Archduke Maximilian Eugen's life. And it lasted, in real terms, for less than 5 months. His victory at Dosso Alto in June 1918, the one that had cost him his hearing and earned him his hero's cross, was rendered utterly, catastrophically meaningless by the events that followed. While he was being celebrated, the Piave offensive had broken the army's back. The empire was not just losing the war, it was disintegrating. By September, the Allied 100 Days offensive on the Western Front had broken the German army. In the Balkans, the Allied army at Salonika, led by the French, smashed the Bulgarian front, and Bulgaria, Austria's ally, surrendered. Suddenly, the entire southern flank of the empire was wide open. There was no one left to fight. The war was over. And here, the central crushing paradox of Maximilian's life slams into focus. He was a man who had proven his mettle in the most modern and brutal of crucibles. The battlefield, he could command troops under fire, navigate the shark-infested waters of high diplomacy, and embody the ideal of a modern, heroic prince. He could win a battle. But he was utterly powerless against an idea. And the idea that swept Europe in October 1918 was republicanism. In the final weeks of the war, the Austro-Hungarian Empire did not just surrender, it evaporated one by one. The nationalities declared their independence. The Czechs and Slovaks formed Czechoslovakia. The South Slavs declared their intention to join Serbia. Creating Yugoslavia, Hungary itself broke away, declaring its own independence. The ancient 600-year-old Habsburg realm simply ceased to exist. On October 31st, 1918, the war party in Vienna admitted defeat, and the government collapsed. His brother, Emperor Karl, was now an emperor of nothing. He had no army, no government, and no country. On November 11th, 1918, the same day the final armistice was signed in the West, Karl was forced to sign a proclamation. In it, he renounced all participation in the affairs of state. It was a carefully worded document. He did not abdicate. That was a word he would never utter. To abdicate was to formally and legally surrender the throne. To admit the dynasty's right to rule was over. He would not and could not do this. He was the anointed emperor. And in his own deeply pious mind, his crown was a sacrament from God that no man or government could take away. He was merely stepping aside until his loyal subjects, once they came to their senses, called him back. This was the collective hubris of the Habsburgs, a profound misunderstanding of the New World. It was a belief that this was all just a temporary, terrible misunderstanding. The next day, November 12th, the Republic of German Austria was formally proclaimed from the steps of the Parliament building in Vienna. The imperial family, including Maximilian, his wife Princess Franziska zu Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Schillingsfürst, whom he had married in the chaotic last year of the war, and his mother, Maria Josepha, retreated to the imperial hunting lodge at Eckartsau, just outside Vienna. They were now prisoners in their own home, guests of a new Republican government that had no idea what to do with them. And it was here, in the cold, damp rooms of this lodge, that Maximilian's dark secret, his fatal flaw, began to emerge. It was not a secret of vice or corruption like his father's. It was in many ways far more destructive. It was his unwavering, unbending, absolute loyalty to the Habsburg tradition. The new socialist government in Vienna, led by Chancellor Karl Renner, had a massive problem. They had a deposed emperor sitting just miles from the capital, who had not abdicated and who was, by his very presence, a lightning rod for any and all counter-revolutionary forces. The family was a living symbol of the old hated regime, a regime that had just led the country to starvation and ruin. As long as they remained, the Republic was not safe. The government tried to negotiate. They offered Karl a simple, quiet exile in Switzerland. He refused. He was still the emperor, and he would not be told to leave by a group of socialist rabble. This stalemate festered for months until March 1919, when a desperate Karl, fearing for his family's safety as street violence in Vienna increased, finally agreed to leave. The British, in a final act of royal solidarity, sent a British officer, Colonel Edward Lisle Strutt, to escort the family to safety. On March 24, 1919, the imperial family was put on a train. As it reached the Austrian border with Switzerland, the new Republican border guards refused to let it pass. The train, still bearing the imperial coat of arms, was a symbol of a government that no longer existed. In a final, humiliating act, the imperial crest was scraped off the side of the car. Karl, standing on the platform, was forced to watch as his 600-year-old dynasty was physically erased. This was the betrayal. This was the moment of abandonment by the nation they had ruled. But the ticking bomb, the true consequence of Maximilian's flaw, was not set for Karl. It was set for those who remained. Maximilian, his mother, and other members of the family had not left with Karl. They, too, were now in a terrible position. The government's patience was gone. The Habsburg problem had to be solved permanently. And so, on April 3, 1919, the Austrian National Assembly passed the law that would define the rest of Maximilian's life. It was and is known simply as the Habsburg Law. It was a document of breathtaking legal brutality. Article 1 formally banished Karl and Empress Zita from the Republic of Austria forever. Article 2 was the true masterstroke. It declared that all other members of the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty were banished and expelled from the country unless they formally renounced their membership in the House of Habsburg and all of its ruling claims and declared themselves to be loyal citizens of the Republic. This was the choice. This was the knife to the throat of their identity. The law did not just demand a political oath, it demanded an act of profound personal betrayal. It forced every archduke and archduchess to answer a single, agonizing question. What is more important, your home or your name? Your country or your family? Your past or your future? For some, the choice was simple, if bitter. They were practical. The empire was gone. A title was just a word. They signed the paper, renounced their claims, claims to a throne that no longer even existed, and became simply Herr or Frau Habsburg, private citizens of Austria. They got to keep their homes, what was left of their property, and their lives. Maximilian Eugen could not do it. This was his fatal flaw, his dark secret, an ironclad loyalty that, in the New World, had become a political and personal liability. How could he? How could he, the hero of Dosso Alto, the man who had bled for the empire, the brother who had stood by Karl, now sign a piece of paper declaring that it was all a lie? How could he renounce his brother, who was at that very moment in Switzerland still claiming to be the rightful emperor? How could he renounce his name, the name his two young sons Ferdinand and Heinrich now carried? To sign would have been a betrayal of his father, his grandfather, his entire lineage. It would have been an admission that his entire life and the sacrifice at Dosso Alto had been for nothing. It was for him a moral impossibility. His unwavering loyalty to the idea of the Habsburg dynasty, his prioritization of dynastic pride and fraternal honor over practical adaptation became his undoing. He refused to sign. The consequences were immediate, automatic, and irreversible. The ticking bomb of the Habsburg law exploded. By refusing to renounce his title, Maximilian was, by that very law, banished from Austria forever. His choice, born of loyalty, had triggered his own permanent exile, and the law had another sharper sting. Article 5. All properties and assets belonging to the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, including the private funds and estates of those family members who were banished, were to be seized and confiscated by the state. This wasn't just exile, it was financial ruin. The palaces, including the Belvedere that had been his home and headquarters, the vast estates, the bank accounts, the art collections, all of it, gone. In a single day, Maximilian went from being a war hero and the second man of an empire to a stateless, penniless refugee with no country, no passport, and no home. This refusal began the long, slow, agonizing chain of displacement that would define the rest of his life. He, his wife Franziska, and his mother Maria Josepha left Austria and joined his brother Karl in Switzerland. But this was not a comfortable retirement. The Swiss government, terrified of being seen as a base for monarchist plots, only allowed them to stay under the strictest, most humiliating conditions. They were to engage in zero political activity. This was almost impossible for Karl, a man who still believed he was a reigning monarch. The family, now living on borrowed money and the charity of other royals, was under constant surveillance. And in this cramped, paranoid environment, the alliance of the family began to fracture, not from disloyalty, but from desperation. The collective hubris of the dynasty, embodied by his brother Karl, made things infinitely worse. In 1921, Karl, believing the Hungarian people were desperate for his return, made two separate disastrous attempts to fly to Hungary and reclaim the throne. Both were catastrophic failures. The first was a political farce. The second ended in a small, pathetic battle. The Hungarian regent Miklos Horthy had Karl arrested. This overreach was the final nail in the coffin. The Allies, furious at Karl for destabilizing Central Europe, seized him. They exiled him, this time for good, to the remote, miserable, and malaria-ridden Portuguese island of Madeira in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with no chance of escape. He died there of pneumonia. Just a year later, in 1922, a broken man at the age of 34, Karl's failed attempts to reclaim his power, his clinging to the past, isolated the entire dynasty, confirming their status as dangerous pariahs. For Maximilian, his brother's death was a personal and political catastrophe. His loyalty was now to a ghost and to a new 10-year-old emperor, his nephew, Otto von Habsburg. The family's financial situation was now beyond dire. Maximilian was forced to live a life of enforced humility, a life that was the complete antithesis of his birth. To travel, to rent a home, to even exist in a world of nation-states, he needed a passport, but he had no nation. He was forced to use aliases, to travel as Count Wernberg or Count von Kaiberg. Think of the psychological toll this man, born Archduke Maximilian Eugen, hero of Dosso Alto, was now reduced to hiding his very identity, to using a fake name just to avoid scrutiny at a border crossing. He, his wife, and his 2 sons moved from Switzerland to Bavaria, settling in Munich and near Lake Starnberg, living in rented villas, always at the mercy of the local government's goodwill. Then, as the political situation in Germany darkened, they moved again to France. He was a prince, but his life was one of constant, humiliating displacement. The grand public achievement of his youth had collided with a private life of quiet failure, all brought on by a single fateful choice in 1919. Then, in 1933, a flicker of a Pyrrhic victory. In Austria, a new authoritarian government, the Austro-fascist regime led by Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, came to power. Dollfuss was a complex figure. He was a patriot who despised the socialists and crucially hated Nazi Germany, which was aggressively trying to annex Austria. He saw the Habsburgs not as a threat, but as a symbol of an independent pre-German Austrian identity. In a bid to shore up his own power and create a new Catholic Austrian nationalism, Dollfuss did the unthinkable. He repealed the Habsburg law. He invited the Habsburgs to return. Maximilian was granted permission to re-enter the country. He could go home. But what a hollow, bitter victory it was. This wasn't a restoration of the monarchy. It was a political maneuver by a dictator in the making. And it was a victory that would prove to be tragically brief. This brief return to his homeland, this faint echo of his former life, was not an end to his exile, but merely a pause. The true betrayal, the final cruel twist of the knife, was yet to come. The victory was a mirage, and the consequence of his 1919 refusal was about to be enforced a second and final time. That fleeting, hollow victory of 1933, the one granted by Chancellor Dollfuss, was not just a mirage, it was a trap. It had brought Maximilian and his family back to an Austria that was itself on the verge of annihilation. Dollfuss, the man who had used the Habsburgs as a symbol of Austrian independence, was assassinated by Nazi agents in 1934. His successor, Kurt Schuschnigg, tried to continue his policies, even flirting with a Habsburg restoration as a desperate last-ditch defense against Hitler, but it was too little, too late. On March 12, 1938, the bottom fell out. Adolf Hitler, the Austrian-born corporal who had once been a failed artist in Vienna, a man who harbored a deep, poisonous and personal hatred for the Habsburg dynasty that he blamed for the multi-ethnic pollution of the old empire, returned to his homeland as a conqueror. The Anschluss had begun. Austria was annexed, and in a single day it ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the Third Reich. For the Habsburgs, this was a catastrophe that dwarfed the fall of the empire in 1918. The new Republican government in 1919 had been political opponents. The Nazis were existential enemies. Hitler saw the Habsburgs, and particularly the pro-independence, pan-European vision of Maximilian's nephew, Otto von Habsburg, as a mortal threat to his greater German Reich. One of the very first acts of the new Nazi regime in Ostmark, as Austria was now called, was to immediately and viciously reinstate the 1919 Habsburg law. This was the second, final, and most brutal expulsion. He was nor kicked out this time by his own socialist countrymen in a political dispute. He was hunted and expelled by a foreign totalitarian invader. The Nazis didn't just banish the Habsburgs. They actively confiscated all their property, including the funds and estates that had been restored to them. They were declared enemies of the Reich. This was no longer a question of dignified exile. This was a matter of survival. Maximilian, his wife Franziska, and his children were now stateless refugees in a continent that was about to be consumed by war, actively wanted by the Gestapo. His sons, Ferdinand and Heinrich, who had been raised in the shadow of this statelessness, were now young men who fully embraced their family's anti-Nazi position. They were, in no uncertain terms, part of the nascent Austrian resistance. Their very presence endangered the entire family. Maximilian, the man who had been a war hero for Austria, was now forced to flee his own homeland, a hunted political refugee. His final exile began, a desperate flight from the encroaching darkness. He and his family made their way to France, a country that was itself living on borrowed time. They settled for a time in Paris, living in the quiet, nervous terror shared by thousands of other anti-fascist refugees. The man who had commanded battles was now reduced to hoping his aliases, Count Wernberg, Count von Kaiberg, were good enough to fool a police checkpoint. The world he had known was not just dead, its grave was being systematically desecrated. Then, in 1940, the final escape route slammed shut. The Nazis invaded France. The Third Republic, which had offered a fragile haven, collapsed in weeks. Maximilian and his family were now trapped in a country occupied by the very regime that wanted them arrested. They were forced to flee again, this time south, to the nominally unoccupied Vichy France, a puppet state that was crawling with German agents and collaborators. We can only imagine the terror of those years, the constant fear of discovery, the poverty, the humiliation. The hero of Dosso Alto, the Archduke who had lived in the Belvedere Palace, was now hiding in rented rooms. His family's safety depended on the kindness of strangers and the inefficiency of the local police. His past life was not just a memory, it was a liability. His name was a death warrant. He survived the war, but it was a survival devoid of triumph, a grim gray endurance test that drained him of what little hope remained. And then in 1945, the war ended. The world was new, the Third Reich was a pile of rubble, and in Austria, a new Second Republic was born from the ashes. And it was this new, democratic, liberated Austria, the Austria he had dreamed of, the Austria his nephew Otto had been working to free, that delivered the final, most soul-crushing betrayal. One of an independent post-war Austria's first acts to immediately and fully reconfirm the validity of the 1919 Habsburg Law. The law was still in effect, the Nazis were gone, but the banishment remained. The victory of 1933 was not just revoked by the Nazis, it was kept revoked by the very people who had been liberated. The message was unmistakable, and this time it was final. You are not welcome. You are not one of us. Your name is a ghost, and we do not want it here. This was a betrayal far deeper than 1919. That had been a revolutionary act in the heat of defeat. This was a cold, calculated, bureaucratic decision by a new democratic state. It was the definitive erasure of his identity. His final exile was not to be in the bustling political centers of Paris or Munich. It was to be a quiet fade out. He settled in Nice on the French Riviera. This was not the glamorous, high-stakes Riviera of casinos and movie stars. This was a place of retirement, a place for those who had been, a place to live out one's days in the quiet anonymity of the Mediterranean sun. It was the perfect tragic metaphor for his life, a beautiful, sunlit, but utterly irrelevant periphery. He was a prince without a country, a hero without a war, a man without a purpose. The grand struggles of his youth, the empire, the war, the diplomacy had been replaced by the simple, quiet daily life of a forgotten man. The end came, as it so often does, not with a bang, but with a whisper. On January 19, 1952, in a place called the Hôtel de Bains in Nice, Archduke Maximilian Eugen of Austria died of a heart attack. He was 56 years old. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. He did not die in the Habsburg palace surrounded by the imperial court. He did not die on a battlefield clutching the Grand Cross he had so bravely earned. He died in a hotel, a place of transience, a place of passage, a non-home. It was the ultimate symbol of his entire life after 1919, a man who was just passing through. His death was a quiet, unceremonious, almost anonymous event, a stark, brutal contrast to the imperial grandeur of his birth and the brief shining heroism of his youth. But Maximilian's life had ended. His final devastating impact was just beginning to reveal itself. And that impact was nothing. There was no chaos, no power vacuum, no political ripples. The world did not notice. The empire was 2 generations gone. His passing was not the fall of a pillar, but the quiet snipping of one last loose thread from an old tapestry. His death merely confirmed what his banishment had begun. He was one less Habsburg problem, one less living reminder of a world that was solidifying the very republic that had cast him out. The lack of chaos was the chaos itself, the deafening silence of his total irrelevance. But the story does not end in that hotel room in Nice. The true ironic story of Maximilian Eugen is not what happened to him, but what happened to those who came after. It is the story of his successors, the story of his 2 sons, Ferdinand and Heinrich. They had been born into this world of exile. Ferdinand was born in 1918, in the final dying gasp of the empire. Heinrich was born in 1925 in Munich, in the heart of their first exile. They inherited their father's titleless, nationless existence, but they did not inherit his fatal flaw. They did not, or could not, chain themselves to the ghost of a dead empire. They adapted. They did the one thing their father's generation had found so difficult. They became normal. They became 20th century men. Ferdinand became a highly successful engineer and businessman. Heinrich became a gifted commercial artist, a painter, a man who built a life with his own hands. They did not try to reclaim a throne. They got jobs, they married, they had children, and they lived productive, private, and crucially stable lives. In the ultimate gentle irony, they found the peace and security their father, the Archduke and war hero, could never grasp. But the most staggering and most poignant irony of all is found in the story of his nephew, the man Maximilian had remained loyal to, the man who was, in dynastic law, his sovereign, Otto von Habsburg. Otto, the 10-year-old boy who had become the emperor when his father Karl died in Madeira, had grown up in the same bitter exile. He too was anti-Nazi. He too was banished by the 1919 law. But Otto was a pragmatist. He was a 20th century political realist. He saw that the world had changed, and he understood that the Habsburg idea could only survive if the imperial claim was laid to rest. And so, in 1961, after decades of legal and political battles, Otto von Habsburg did the one thing his uncle Maximilian had found morally, spiritually, and existentially impossible. He signed the paper. He formally, and in accordance with the Habsburg law, renounced all claims to the Austrian throne and all dynastic privileges. He declared himself a simple, loyal citizen of the Republic of Austria. The decision sent shockwaves through the old monarchist circles. But for Otto, it was not a betrayal. It was a liberation. It was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a new one. After a furious national debate, the Austrian government accepted his renunciation in 1966. Dr. Otto Habsburg Lothringen was issued an Austrian passport. He was allowed to go home, and what did he do? He did not retreat into obscurity. He became one of the most respected and influential political figures of his time. He was elected as a member of the European Parliament for Germany. Serving for 2 decades, he was a chief architect of the European Union, a tireless champion of democracy, and one of the loudest, most effective anti-communist voices in the West. He, by renouncing the dynasty, had achieved a moral authority and a real-world political relevance that was 1,000 times greater than any his father or uncle had ever known. He had, in effect, dismantled the very tradition of dynastic loyalty that Maximilian had sacrificed his entire life to preserve. Maximilian's life is a quiet, haunting testament to the tragedy of principle and a reminder that sometimes the most profound loyalty to the past is the one thing that guarantees you have no place in the future. He became the last echo of a vanished world, watching history move on without him.